The song is a ghost. It slips through the cracks in the raucous noise of the gilded cage saloon, a thin, silver thread of sorrow in a room choking on cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. On the rickety stage, a girl named Alara sings. Her voice isn't loud or brassy like the other girls who shout bawdy tunes. It's a clear, heartbreaking melody that speaks of rain-soaked fields in a land left far behind, of promises that turn to dust in her hands. She sings of lost dreams, and most of the men in the saloon don't want to hear it. They want noise, laughter, and the illusion of fortune, not a reminder of all they've lost. A beefy miner, his face caked in grime, hurls a half-empty mug that shatters against the wall behind her. "Sing something lively, girl, or get off," he bellows, and a few others cheer in agreement. Alara flinches, her voice faltering for a moment, but she continues, her eyes closing as if to shut out the hostile room. She sings for herself now, a final, quiet lament. In the corner, a man sits alone, untouched by the chaos. He is a drifter, his clothes worn but clean, his face a map of sun and wind and silence. He isn't drinking, just watching. And unlike the others, he is listening. Every note of her song seems to land inside him, finding an echo in a place he thought long dead. He sees past the cheap, satin dress that hangs loose on her thin frame. He hears the soul of the woman beneath the saloon girl's paint. The saloon owner, Jedediah Barlow, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes, stomps toward the stage. The song dies in Alara's throat as he grabs her arm, his fingers digging in like talons. "That's enough of that caterwauling," he snarls, his voice a low growl that cuts through the din. "You're scaring off my customers. You're fired." He shoves her toward the back door, the one that opens onto the filth-strewn alley. "Get your things. You've got 5 minutes before I throw you out myself." The drifter's hand tightens around the handle of his coffee cup. He watches as the girl, her face pale and stark, disappears behind the stage. He sees the sneers from the other girls, the triumphant smirk on Barlow's face. He sees a dream not just lost, but murdered and discarded in the dirt. And in that moment, something inside him, a stone that has sat in his gut for years, finally shifts. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. A few minutes later, the back door creaks open and Alara is pushed out into the alley, a small, worn carpet bag clutched in her hand. The door slams shut behind her, the bolts sliding home with a sound of finality. She stands there, a solitary figure in the encroaching dusk, the jeers from the saloon a muffled roar behind the wood. She is alone, penniless, and rejected in Dust Devil Gulch, a town that had a habit of swallowing people whole. The drifter rises from his table, leaving a few coins behind. He moves toward the front doors, his steps slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on the alley he knows she now occupies. His life had been a long, straight line of leaving things behind. But as he stepped out into the cooling air, he had the strange and unsettling feeling that he was about to walk towards something for the first time in a decade. The dust of the alley clung to the hem of Alara's dress, a fine red powder that felt like a final insult. She sank down onto an overturned crate, the splintered wood biting into her legs through the thin fabric. The carpet bag rested at her feet, containing the entirety of her worldly possessions, a spare dress, even more threadbare than the one she wore, a small book of poems with a pressed flower between its pages, and a tarnished silver locket from a mother she barely remembered. It wasn't much to show for a life that had traveled 1,000 miles chasing a lie. She remembered the man in Philadelphia, his promises as polished as his boots. He'd spoken of a grand theater in a burgeoning western city, of audiences hushed in rapt attention, of a place where her voice would be celebrated. She, a baker's daughter who had only ever sung in the church choir, had believed him. She had poured her small inheritance, the meager sum left after her father's passing, into the train ticket and the hope he was selling. The reality had been Dust Devil Gulch, a town that was little more than a festering sore on the hide of the prairie, and the gilded cage, which was no theater but a glorified barn full of broken men and desperate women. Jed Barlow had taken one look at her, listened to one of her hopeful ballads, and laughed. He'd told her she could sing her sad songs for now, but she'd have to learn the other duties of a saloon girl if she wanted to earn her keep. She had tried. She had tried to smile, to flirt, to pour whiskey with a steady hand, and ignore the groping fingers and foul breath of the patrons. But her heart wasn't in it. Her heart was in the melodies that spoke of what was, and what could have been. And tonight, that heart had cost her the only roof over her head. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. What was the point? She was adrift, a ship with no anchor and no harbor in sight. From the mouth of the alley, Silas watched her. He kept to the shadows, his presence as unassuming as a weathered fence post. He'd seen 100 women like her in a dozen towns like this one. Usually, he kept walking. Getting involved was a fool's game, a sure way to find trouble or, worse, attachment. But her song, it had snagged on something inside him, a rusted hook he thought had broken off long ago. It wasn't just the sadness in it, it was the purity. It was a diamond singing from a mud puddle. His own past was a horizon he never stopped riding away from. He carried the ghosts of a wife's laughter and a son's small hand in his. They were phantoms conjured by the flicker of a campfire, by the smell of wood smoke, by the cry of a lone hawk. A fire had taken them. A prairie fire he had been too slow to fight, too far away to prevent. He had been checking fence lines, feeling proud of the life he was building, when the smoke had appeared on the horizon. By the time he got back, the horizon had swallowed everything he loved. So he had started moving, believing that if he never stood still, the grief couldn't catch him. He hadn't known more than what his horse could carry in 10 years. He hadn't spoken more than 100 words in a single day. He hadn't let himself feel anything but the wind and the sun and the ache in his bones. Until tonight. Her song had been about lost dreams, and his entire life was a monument to a dream that had burned to the ground. He saw the same hollow ache in her eyes that he saw in his own reflection in a still creek. The relative quiet of the evening was shattered as the saloon's back door flew open again. Jed Barlow stood framed in the yellow light, a cigar jutting from his teeth. He wasn't looking at Alara. He was looking up and down the alley, as if checking for witnesses. He took a long draw from his cigar, the tip glowing like a malevolent eye, and then spat a wad of tobacco juice that landed inches from Alara's worn-out boots. "Still here," he sneered, though it wasn't a real question. "Don't you have a ditch to crawl into?" Alara flinched, but didn't respond. She just stared at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. A respectable-looking woman, the wife of the town's blacksmith, happened to be passing the mouth of the alley. She took one look at Alara, her lip curling in disdain, and then deliberately crossed the street, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as if to ward off contamination. That single act of public scorn seemed to hurt Alara more than Barlow's cruelty. Her shoulders slumped, the last bit of fight draining out of her. Silas felt a low, unfamiliar anger begin to smolder in his chest. It was the injustice of it. The town that profited from men's vices condemned the women who served them. He had seen it time and again. He remained in the shadows, his body tense. He was still telling himself to walk away. It wasn't his fight. She wasn't his problem. But his feet felt rooted to the spot. He saw the fragility of her, but also the stubborn refusal to completely break. It was in the set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine, even as she slumped. It was the same stubbornness that kept him putting one foot in front of the other, day after desolate day. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving bruises of purple and orange on the clouds. The air grew cooler. Soon it would be dark, and the alley would become a place of even greater dangers. He knew he had to make a choice. Walk away and let the world have her, or do something he hadn't done in a very, very long time. Get involved. The decision was made for him. A trio of cowboys, their steps unsteady and their laughter loud and cruel, stumbled out of the gilded cage's main entrance and rounded the corner into the alley. They were young, drunk, and full of the mean-spirited confidence that cheap liquor provides. Their eyes landed on Alara, and a slow, predatory grin spread across the leader's face. "Well, look what we have here," the cowboy drawled, his voice slurring. "Looks like Barlow finally threw out the trash." His two companions snickered, fanning out to block the alley's exit. Alara scrambled to her feet, pulling her carpetbag close to her chest like a shield. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had dealt with men like these every night in the saloon, but always with the flimsy protection of a crowd and a bar between them. Here, in the shadows, there was nothing. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice a reedy whisper, betraying the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. "Leave you alone?" The leader took a staggering step closer, his breath a foul cloud of whiskey and onions. "Now why would we do that? You're free now. No price tag. Ain't that right, boys?" They closed in, their intentions clear and ugly. Alara backed away until her shoulders hit the rough brick wall of the saloon. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. She was trapped. She braced herself, a silent scream caught in her throat. And then a voice, calm and low as a river stone, cut through the tension. "That's far enough." Everyone froze. Silas stepped out of the shadows. He didn't look like much, just a drifter in a dusty coat. He wasn't big or overtly muscular, but there was an economy to his movements, a stillness in his gaze that was more intimidating than any drunken swagger. He hadn't drawn a weapon. He hadn't even raised his voice. He just stood there, a solid, immovable object between them and her. The lead cowboy squinted at him. "Who the hell are you?" "This ain't your business, friend." "You're bothering the lady," Silas said, his voice still quiet, yet it carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "I'm making it my business." The cowboy scoffed, emboldened by his friends. "She ain't a lady. She's a saloon whore," Barlow threw away. "Now move aside before you get hurt." He reached for Alara. Silas moved. It wasn't a blur of motion, but a single, fluid, and shockingly fast act. He closed the distance in 2 steps, his hand shooting out to catch the cowboy's wrist. His grip was like iron. The cowboy's eyes widened in pain and surprise as Silas applied pressure. With a simple, brutal twist, he forced the man to his knees. The other two, who had been laughing moments before, sobered up instantly, their hands hovering uncertainly near their hips. "I'm not going to tell you again," Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more chilling than a shout. He looked from the man on his knees to the two standing frozen. "Leave." The word hung in the air, absolute and non-negotiable. The cowboy on the ground whimpered, and Silas released him with a shove. The man scrambled backward in the dirt, clutching his wrist. Without another word, the 3 of them turned and practically ran from the alley, their drunken bravado vanishing into the night. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Alara was still pressed against the wall, her breathing ragged. She stared at Silas, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The quiet intensity that had unnerved the cowboys now seemed less threatening, more solid. He took a small step back, giving her space. "You all right, miss?" She could only manage a shaky nod, her voice gone. He looked around the desolate alley, then back at her. "You can't stay here. This town, it's no place for you to be alone." Tears of frustration and fear welled in her eyes. "I have nowhere else to go." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the open prairie beyond the town. He seemed to be having an argument with himself. The drifter in him screamed to mount his horse and ride, to leave this complication behind. But the man who had listened to her song, the man who remembered what it was to lose everything, couldn't do it. He finally looked at her, his decision made. "I'm riding out at first light. Heading west. There's a town about 3 days from here, bigger than this one. Might be a chance for you there." He hesitated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "You can travel with me. For safety. I've got enough supplies." Alara stared at him, stunned. A stranger, a silent drifter, was offering her protection? In her experience, men didn't offer anything for free. She looked into his eyes, searching for the trick, the angle. But she saw none. She saw only a deep, weary sadness, and a sincerity that was as stark and real as the hard-packed earth beneath her feet. It was a fool's choice, perhaps, to trust another stranger. But staying here was a certain kind of death. Going with him was, at the very least, a chance at life. "Why?" she whispered, the question hanging between them. Silas's gaze was direct. "Because nobody deserves to be thrown out like trash." He gestured to the small camp he'd made at the edge of town, barely visible in the gloom. "Get some rest. We leave when the sun comes up." He turned and walked away without waiting for her answer, as if he knew she had no other choice to make. Alara watched him go, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. She picked up her carpetbag, her knuckles white, and took a hesitant step, then another, following the stranger out of the alley and away from the wreckage of her past. The first night at their shared camp was a lesson in silence. Silas had a small fire going, a tiny beacon of warmth against the immense, dark canvas of the plains. He had given her a bedroll and a tin plate of beans, then retreated to the other side of the flames, where he sat cleaning his pistol with meticulous, focused movements. He didn't speak, and Alara, consumed by a swirling mix of fear and a fragile, unfamiliar sense of security, didn't know what to say. Every sound was magnified in the quiet. The crackle of the fire, the lonely cry of a coyote in the distance, the soft stamp and sigh of Silas's horse, a sturdy buckskin tethered nearby. Alara ate her beans slowly, stealing glances at the man across the fire. He was a paradox. His actions in the alley had been swift and violent, yet his presence now was anything but threatening. He seemed to take up as little space as possible, his stillness a stark contrast to the boisterous, demanding men she had grown accustomed to. His hands, she noticed, were calloused and capable as they worked on the gun, but there was a gentleness in the way he handled the pieces, a respect for the tool. She tried to thank him, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "That was what you did back there, thank you." He glanced up, his eyes catching the firelight. They were a pale, washed-out blue, like a winter sky. He gave a curt nod, his attention already returning to his work. No need for thanks. Just decency. The word hung in the air. Decency. It was a currency she hadn't seen traded in a long time. It made her feel both grateful and deeply unsettled. She was used to transactions, to every kindness having a price. His lack of expectation was more disarming than any threat. She finished her meal and washed her plate in the small basin of water he'd set out, her movements careful and quiet, trying not to disturb the fragile peace of their camp. When she lay down on her bedroll, she pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin, but sleep was a distant shore. She lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the night and the steady, rhythmic sound of Silas cleaning his weapon, a sound that should have been terrifying but was, somehow, reassuring. It was the sound of a man who was prepared, a man who was watching over her. The next few days of travel established a rhythm. They rose before the sun, shared a breakfast of hardtack and coffee made in a smoke-blackened pot, and rode until the sun was high and hot in the sky. They rested during the worst of the heat and continued in the late afternoon, making camp as dusk fell. Conversation was sparse, limited to the practicalities of the journey. Water barrels getting low, ground's too rocky here. We'll push on another mile, keep an eye out for rattlers. Despite the lack of words, Alara began to learn about Silas through his actions. He was a man who understood the land. He knew how to find water where it seemed there was none, how to read the clouds for signs of a coming storm, how to move through the world without leaving much of a trace. He was patient with his horse, speaking to it in a low, gentle murmur that was softer than any tone he used with her. He was also observant. On the second day, he noticed her wincing as she walked, her cheap saloon shoes falling apart. That evening, he produced a pair of worn but sturdy men's boots from his saddlebags. "They'll be too big," he said gruffly, not meeting her eye. "But better than what you've got." He also handed her a roll of cloth. "Stuff this in the toes." Alara was speechless. The boots were an incredible luxury, a profound act of kindness. She mumbled her thanks, her cheeks flushing. When she put them on, they were indeed too large, but with the cloth stuffed in the front, they were solid and protective. For the first time, she felt like she could walk across this harsh country instead of just being dragged through it. In turn, Silas began to see a different Alara from the broken girl in the alley. He saw her resilience. She never complained about the heat, the dust, or the meager rations. She walked when he told her to spare the horse, her small figure trudging determinately beside him. He noticed her hands, though soft, were quick and nimble. She took the mending kit from his pack one evening and, without being asked, began repairing a tear in his shirt with stitches so small and neat they were nearly invisible. He watched her, fascinated. It was a skill that spoke of a different life, a quieter, more domestic world than the gilded cage. One afternoon, as they rested in the sparse shade of a lone cottonwood tree, she began to hum. It was one of the sad, beautiful melodies she had sung in the saloon. The tune drifted on the hot air, a counterpoint to the buzz of insects and the rustle of dry leaves. Silas, who had been checking his horse's hooves, went still. He listened, his head bowed, and for the first time since she'd met him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was gone in an instant, but Alara saw it. The sight of it sent a strange, warm flutter through her chest. It was a glimpse of the man behind the wall of silence, a hint of a soul that understood her own sorrowful music. That evening, a storm rolled in. It came suddenly, the sky turning from a placid blue to a bruised, angry purple in a matter of minutes. The wind howled, whipping sand and dust into their faces. Silas acted quickly, leading them to a small rock outcropping that offered minimal shelter. He secured the horse and unrolled a heavy canvas tarp, creating a makeshift lean-to. They huddled together underneath it as the heavens opened up. Rain fell in thick, driving sheets, and lightning splintered the sky, followed by claps of thunder that vibrated through the ground. Alara, who had always been terrified of storms, squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the violent symphony. A particularly loud crash of thunder made her jump, and a small, involuntary cry escaped her lips. She felt a sudden weight on her shoulder. She opened her eyes to see Silas's hand resting there. It wasn't a romantic or familiar touch. It was solid, grounding, a simple human gesture that said, "I am here. You are not alone." "It'll pass," he said, his voice a low rumble just beside her ear, barely audible over the roar of the storm. She leaned into the touch just slightly, drawing strength from it. They sat that way for what felt like hours, side by side in the dark, the storm raging around them, creating a small, isolated world for just the two of them. In that moment, he was no longer just a stranger or a rescuer. He was a companion, and the shared vulnerability of weathering the storm together forged a bond stronger than any words they could have spoken. The next day, the world was washed clean. The air was crisp, and the desert, which had seemed so dead and brown, was dotted with the surprising color of new blooms. As they were packing up their damp gear, Silas paused. He walked a few feet away and knelt, plucking a single, delicate desert marigold that had opened its face to the morning sun. He walked back to Alara and held it out to her. He said nothing. His face was as stoic as ever. Alara took the flower, its vibrant yellow a stark contrast to their dusty, trail-worn surroundings. She looked from the flower to his face, and for the first time, she felt bold enough to truly meet his gaze. She saw the weariness there, the deep-set lines of sorrow, but she also saw something else, a flicker of gentleness, a deep well of kindness he tried so hard to hide. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He just nodded and turned back to saddling his horse, the moment of connection already sealed away behind his usual reserve. But Alara knew it had happened. She carefully tucked the flower into the buttonhole of her dress, a small, bright promise she carried with her as they continued their journey west. The landscape was changing, the flat, scrubby plains beginning to swell into rolling hills and rocky mesas. So, too, was the landscape between them changing, shifting from a terrain of cautious distance to one of quiet, shared understanding. Their fragile peace was shattered when they reached a trading post, a solitary adobe building that seemed to sprout from the baked earth like a mushroom. It was their first encounter with civilization since leaving Dust Devil Gulch, and Alara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Civilization meant people, and people meant judgment. Silas seemed to feel it too. His posture stiffened as they approached, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "We need supplies," he stated, his voice flat. "Stay close to the horse. I'll handle it." The trading post was run by a greasy, weasel-faced man with shifty eyes. A few other hard-bitten men loitered on the porch, spitting tobacco and eyeing their arrival with lazy curiosity. As Silas went inside, Alara stood by the buckskin, trying to make herself as small as possible, her gaze fixed on the horizon. One of the men on the porch, a large man with a tangled, greasy beard, detached himself from the wall and sauntered over. He circled the horse, then let his eyes roam over Alara in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well now," he said, a leering grin spreading across his face. "I remember you. The little songbird from Barlow's place. Heard he kicked you out." He looked from her to the trading post door and back again. Looks like you found a new owner quick enough. How much this one paying ya? The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. She was branded. No matter how far she traveled, the stink of the gilded cage would follow her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. All the newfound strength she'd felt seemed to evaporate under his contemptuous gaze. Before he could say another word, the door of the trading post creaked open. Silas emerged, his saddlebags now full. He took in the scene at a glance. The leering man, Alara's pale face, the way she was shrinking into herself. His expression, usually so placid, became dangerously cold. "Is there a problem here?" Silas asked, his voice deceptively soft. The big man turned, sizing Silas up with a dismissive sneer. "No problem. Just talking to the girl. Wondering what her price is these days." Silas set his supplies down with deliberate care. He walked slowly until he was standing directly in front of the man, who was a head taller and 50 pounds heavier. Silas had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "She's not for sale," Silas said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "And she's not to be spoken to. Now, I think you were just leaving." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Or what, Drifter? You gonna make me?" Silas didn't answer with words. His hand moved in a blur, not for his gun, but for the man's throat. His fingers clamped down, and he shoved the man backward, slamming him hard against the adobe wall. The man's laughter died in a choked gasp. Dust puffed from the wall around his head. Silas's face was inches from his pale blue eyes like chips of ice. "I don't like to repeat myself," Silas whispered, the words filled with a chilling lethality. "Walk away." Now, he held the man pinned for a second longer, letting the terror sink in, then released him abruptly. The man stumbled, gasping for air, his face mottled with red and white patches. He gave Silas a look of pure, terrified hatred, then turned and scurried away, joining his companions who had watched the entire exchange in stunned silence. Without a word, they all mounted their horses and rode off in a hurry. Silas stood for a moment, his chest rising and falling, the tightly coiled violence slowly receding. He turned back to Alara. She was staring at him, her expression a mixture of awe and fear. She had seen him defend her before, but this was different. This wasn't just decency, it was personal. It was fiercely protective. He seemed to realize how he must look to her, and a shadow of his old reserve fell back over his features. He picked up his supplies and began loading them onto the horse, his movements stiff. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It was charged with unspoken questions. They had been forced to confront the perception of their arrangement, and in doing so, the reality of it had become far more complicated. They rode away from the trading post without a word, the incident hanging in the air between them. The easy rhythm they had found was broken. Alara kept stealing glances at him, replaying the cold fury in his eyes. She should have been afraid of him, of that capacity for violence that lay just beneath his quiet surface. Instead, she felt a profound sense of safety, and something more, something that made her heart ache with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. He had defended her honor when she thought she had none left. That night, the silence around the campfire was different. It was heavy with things unsaid. Finally, it was Silas who broke it. "What he said back there," he began, his voice rough as he stared into the flames. "That's what people will think." Alara wrapped her arms around her knees. "I know. When we get to the next town," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the fire, "it might be best if we go our separate ways immediately. It'll be better for you. You can make a fresh start, without a man like me casting a shadow on you." His words were meant to be practical, perhaps even kind, but they felt like a rejection. The thought of being alone again, of facing another town, another set of judgmental eyes without his solid, silent presence beside her, was terrifying. She had grown used to the safety of his shadow. "And what about you?" she asked quietly. "Where will you go?" He shrugged, a gesture that encompassed the vast, empty wilderness around them. "Keep moving. It's what I do. Don't you ever want to stop?" The question was out before she could stop it, too bold, too personal. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of the profound loneliness he carried. "Wanting and having are two different things, miss." The conversation ended there, but the seed of an idea had been planted. The next day, as they rode through a shallow valley, they saw it. Tucked against the base of a mesa, sheltered from the wind, was a small, abandoned homestead. A cabin, its roof partially caved in, stood beside a broken-down corral and a stone-lined well. A creek, lined with cottonwoods, trickled nearby, a ribbon of life in the arid land. It was a ruin, a ghost of someone else's failed dream. They stopped, drawn by the sight. It should have been a sad place, but it wasn't. The structure of the cabin was solid, built of sturdy timber. The land around it was good, the soil dark near the creek. There was a sense of peace about the place, of potential. Alara slid off the horse and walked slowly toward the cabin, her new boots making soft prints in the dust. She peered through a grimy window. Inside was a wreck of broken furniture and debris, but the stone fireplace was intact. She could imagine it with a fire roaring, a clean-swept floor, a simple table and chairs. She could imagine a home. Silas dismounted and came to stand beside her, his gaze sweeping over the property. He was assessing it with a practical eye, noting the work that would be needed, the roof, the well, the fences. It would be a mountain of work, an impossible task for one person. Someone gave up, he said, his voice flat. Or maybe, Alara said softly, her eyes full of a hope she hadn't felt in years. They were just waiting for someone else to start over. The words hung in the air between them, a question and a possibility all at once. To stay here would be to stop running. For both of them. It was a terrifying, audacious thought. But as Alara looked at the dilapidated cabin, and then at the quiet, haunted man beside her, she realized she was more afraid of leaving than she was of staying. This ruin, this ghost of a home, felt more real and full of promise than any town on a map. The decision to stay wasn't made with words. It was made in the quiet actions of the following day. Silas, instead of packing their gear to leave, took an axe from his pack and began clearing the fallen timbers from the cabin's roof. Alara, taking her cue from him, found a tattered broom inside the cabin and began the monumental task of sweeping out years of accumulated dust, dirt, and debris. They worked all day in a shared, unspoken agreement. The hard physical labor was a relief, a way to channel all the tension and uncertainty that had built between them. As they worked, a new dynamic emerged. They were no longer drifter and damsel, but partners. He taught her how to mix mud and straw to chink the logs, and was surprised by how quickly she learned, her small hands proving deft and strong. She, in turn, brought a sense of order to their chaotic surroundings. She scrubbed the grime from the one intact window until it sparkled, and she found a patch of wild mint growing by the creek, crushing the leaves to fill the musty cabin with a fresh, clean scent. Evenings were spent by the fire, exhausted but with a sense of accomplishment they had never shared on the trail. They began to talk. Not about the future, which was still a terrifyingly blank canvas, but about the past. The stories came out in fragments, offered tentatively into the safe space of the night. She told him about her father, the baker, and the smell of fresh bread that had filled her childhood. She spoke of her mother's locket and the book of poems, the only tangible pieces of a life she'd left behind. She confessed her foolishness in believing the man from Philadelphia, her voice thick with shame. Silas listened, his gaze steady and non-judgmental. And one night, as the embers of the fire glowed like sleeping eyes, he finally offered a piece of his own broken history. "I had a place like this once," he said, his voice low and raspy with disuse. "Smaller. A wife, Mary, and a boy, Sam." He fell silent for a long time, and Alara held her breath, knowing this was sacred, painful ground. "He had his mother's laugh," Silas continued, his eyes focused on a distant, painful memory. "And he was always chasing butterflies. We were going to build another room for him in the spring." He took a shaky breath. "There was a fire. A grass fire, moved faster than a running horse. I was out on the north pasture. By the time I saw the smoke," his voice broke. He didn't need to finish the story. The ending was carved into every line on his face. "I couldn't save them," he whispered, the words raw with a guilt that had been poisoning him for a decade. "A man is supposed to protect his family. I failed. After that, there was nothing to stay for. Nothing I deserved." Tears streamed down Alara's face, not for herself, but for him. For the wife with the laugh and the little boy who chased butterflies. She understood now. His silence, his constant motion, his refusal to connect, it was all a penance. He was a man living in the ashes of his own life. Without thinking, she reached across the small space between them and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath her touch. He flinched, as if contact might burn him. But he didn't pull away. "It wasn't your fault," she said, her voice soft but firm. "A fire. That's not something a man can fight alone. It's not your fault, Silas." He looked at her then, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. No one had ever said those words to him. He had carried the blame like a shroud for so long. It had become a part of him. Her simple, absolute belief in his innocence was a crack of light in his long darkness. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart began to crumble. That night, something fundamental shifted. They were no longer just two strangers bound by circumstance. They were two broken souls who had found in each other a reflection of their own pain and a flicker of the possibility of healing. Their tentative peace was destined to be short-lived. A few weeks into their work on the homestead, as the roof was nearly patched and a small garden had been cleared by the creek, a rider appeared on the horizon. As he drew closer, a cold dread washed over Alara. It was one of Jedediah Barlow's men, the one who served as his sycophantic right hand. The man reined in his horse a safe distance away, his eyes taking in the work they had done with a contemptuous smirk. "Barlow wants to see you," he called out, his voice dripping with false authority. "He says the girl stole from him before she ran off. $100. The lie was so audacious it stole Alara's breath. "I never stole anything." The man ignored her. His gaze settled on Silas. "And he says you're trespassing. This land, this creek, he's filing a claim on it. He's giving you a choice. Hand over the girl to work off her debt and be gone by sunrise tomorrow. Or he'll come back with the sheriff from the next county over and see you both arrested. Her for theft, you for trespassing and harboring a fugitive." Silas stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Alara. His face was a mask of cold fury. "This is unclaimed land, and she doesn't owe him anything." The man laughed. "Barlow's got friends. His word against a drifter's and a saloon girl's? Who do you think the law is gonna believe?" "Sunrise," he repeated, spitting on the ground. "Then this all becomes his." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating sense of doom in his wake. The threat was real and immediate. Barlow wasn't just after Alara, he was after their home. He saw the work they had done, the life they were trying to build, and, like a vulture, he wanted to pick it clean. The old Silas, the drifter, would have run. It was the logical choice. Pack up, disappear into the wilderness, and leave the trouble behind. He looked at the cabin, at the newly patched roof that had cost him sweat and blood. He looked at the small patch of turned earth where Alara planned to plant seeds. And then he looked at her. Her face was pale with fear, but her eyes were blazing with a defiant fire he had never seen before. "I'm not going back there," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I won't let him take this. I won't be run off again." Her courage was a revelation. This was not the frightened girl from the alley. This was a woman who had found something worth fighting for. And in that moment, Silas knew he couldn't run either. Running now would be a betrayal not just of her, but of the man he was slowly, painfully, starting to become again. To run would be to admit that he was still the man who failed to protect his family. To stay, to fight, was to finally face the fire. "We're not running," he said, his voice quiet but unshakable. "This is our home. We'll stand our ground." A plan began to form in his mind, a desperate gamble based on the character of men like Barlow. They wouldn't wait for the sheriff. That was a bluff. Barlow was a man who enjoyed his own brand of justice. He would come himself, with his own men, expecting two terrified people to be an easy conquest. "He'll come at dawn," Silas said, his mind working quickly. "He'll want to make a show of it." He looked at Alara, his expression grim but determined. "We need to be ready." They spent the rest of the day and most of the night in a flurry of tense, focused preparation. There was no longer any room for hesitation or doubt. There was only the cold, hard reality of the coming dawn. The sun had not yet breached the horizon when they came. 3 figures on horseback cresting the hill against the pale, pre-dawn light. Jedediah Barlow was in the lead, flanked by 2 of his hired thugs, the same ones Silas had seen loitering around the saloon. They rode with an arrogant slowness, savoring the moment, certain of their victory. They expected to find their victims either gone or cowering in fear. They found neither. Silas stood on the porch of the small cabin, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He wasn't aiming it. Its mere presence was a statement. Beside him, Alara stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale, but her expression firm. They were not hiding. They were waiting. The homestead, once a symbol of hope, had become their fortress. Barlow reined in his horse 20 yards from the porch, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. Well, still here. I'm surprised. I figured a yellow-bellied drifter like you would have been long gone by now. His eyes slid to Alara, his gaze slimy and possessive. And you, girl, you've caused a lot of trouble. Time to come pay what you owe. I owe you nothing, Jedediah, Alara said, and the sound of her own voice, clear and strong in the morning stillness, seemed to surprise even her. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a hot, righteous anger. You paid me a pittance for my songs, and you took the rest. The only thief here is you. Barlow's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of fury. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not by her. You've got a sharp tongue on you now. This drifter been teaching you new tricks. He turned his attention back to Silas. Last chance. Give me the girl and get off my land. This isn't your land, Silas said, his voice calm and even, a dangerous counterpoint to Barlow's blustering rage. And she's not going anywhere. Then I'll take her, Barlow roared, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. It was the moment everything had been leading to. But before Barlow could even clear his leather, Alara did something no one expected. She began to sing. It wasn't one of her sad laments. It was a new song, one born of fire and defiance. Her voice soared into the morning air, pure and powerful, a weapon in its own right. It was a song about a man whose greed was a cage of his own making, a man who thought he could own people but only owned his own empty heart. The melody was haunting, the words sharp as glass, and it was aimed directly at Barlow, stripping away his bluster and exposing the pathetic, cruel man beneath. The two thugs shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between their boss and the singing woman. Barlow, momentarily stunned by the audacity of it, was frozen in place, his face turning a dark, mottled red. Her song was his public shaming, a judgment delivered not by a court, but by the victim he had sought to crush. Enraged and humiliated, Barlow finally drew his gun, his face a mask of pure hatred. "Shut her up," he screamed. But as he raised his pistol, Silas moved. He wasn't faster than a bullet, but he was smarter. He had anticipated this. In one smooth motion, he dropped to one knee, raising his rifle. He didn't aim for Barlow. He aimed for the ground just in front of Barlow's horse. He fired once. The crack of the rifle echoed through the valley. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt and rock, spooking the horse. The animal reared violently, screaming in terror. Barlow, caught off guard, was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in the dust with an undignified grunt. His pistol flew from his hand, landing several feet away. The two thugs, seeing their employer unhorsed and their easy victory evaporate, hesitated. That hesitation was all Silas needed. "Drop your guns," Silas commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that could not be questioned. He levered another round into the chamber, the sound loud and final in the sudden silence. Now, one look at the icy resolve in his eyes was enough. The thugs, mere bullies with no stomach for a real fight, slowly raised their hands and let their pistols fall to the ground. Silas stood up, the rifle still trained on them. Alara's song had stopped, her part in the battle finished. She watched, her heart pounding, as Silas walked calmly over to the sputtering, dust-covered saloon owner. Barlow scrambled for his discarded pistol, but Silas's boot came down hard on his wrist. Barlow cried out in pain. Silas bent down, picking up the gun. He looked down at the man who had caused them so much pain, the man who represented all the ugliness they had tried to escape. He could have ended it right there. The old Silas, the one consumed by rage and grief, might have. But this Silas was different. "Get on your horse," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "You and your men. Ride out of this valley and don't ever come back. If I ever see your face again, on this land or anywhere near her, you'll find out that my aim is better than you think." He backed away, his rifle still ready. Barlow, clutching his wrist, staggered to his feet, his face a mess of dirt, sweat, and pure, impotent fury. He was beaten, utterly and completely humiliated, not just by the drifter's gun, but by the saloon girl's song. Without a word, he retrieved his horse, climbed clumsily into the saddle, and, with one last venomous glare, rode away. His men, looking relieved to escape with their lives, quickly followed. They watched until the three riders were nothing but small specks on the horizon. The dust settled. The sun was finally cresting the mesa, bathing the small homestead in a warm, golden light. The threat was gone. Alara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked at Silas, who was still standing there, rifle in hand, a sentinel guarding their home. He had done it. He had faced the fire, and he hadn't run. He had protected her, protected them. He finally lowered the rifle and turned to look at her. The tension drained from his face, replaced by a profound weariness, but also a deep, quiet relief. The silence that fell between them was no longer awkward or heavy. It was peaceful, filled with the immensity of what they had just overcome together. He walked back to the porch, his steps slow. He stopped in front of her, his pale eyes searching her face. He saw no fear there, only a deep, unwavering trust and an emotion that mirrored the one blooming, fierce and undeniable, in his own chest. He looked out at the vast landscape stretching before them, the endless horizon that had once been his escape, the symbol of his constant running. It looked different now. It no longer looked empty. He turned his gaze back to her, to the woman who had faced down her tormentor with a song, the woman whose courage had given him a reason to stop. "I've been chasing the horizon my whole life, running from ghosts," he said, his voice thick with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to name for 10 years. "But I'm done running." He reached out and gently took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "You're my horizon now, Alara." The words were a vow, a promise of a future built not on escaping the past, but on planting roots in the here and now. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, but for the first time in a very long time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She squeezed his hand, her answer not in words, but in the simple, powerful connection that flowed between them. They stood together on the porch of their small, battered cabin, watching the sunrise. The light spilled across the land, chasing away the last of the shadows, and for the first time, it felt like it was rising just for them. The air, crisp and clean after the confrontation, smelled of dust and wild mint. The world felt new. Silas finally leaned his rifle against the cabin wall, the gesture a quiet declaration that the fight was over. The peace they had fought for was real. He didn't let go of her hand. The warmth of her grasp was an anchor, holding him steady in this new, unfamiliar territory of hope. He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face, her features softened by the morning light. The last traces of the saloon girl were gone, replaced by the quiet strength of a woman who had found her home. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes and started to hum. It wasn't a sad tune of lost dreams, but a simple, hopeful melody that seemed to weave itself into the fabric of the morning. It was the sound of a new beginning. He listened, a sense of profound contentment settling over him, a feeling he thought he had lost forever in the smoke and ashes of his past. This was home. Not the cabin, not the land, but this feeling, right here, with her. The dilapidated structure no longer looked like a ruin. It was a promise waiting to be fulfilled, a life waiting to be lived. The vast western landscape stretched before them, no longer a place to get lost in, but a canvas on which they would build their future together. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.